ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here in New Zealand, without doubt the most beautiful country on earth. The 30-second version of my positioning is the following. The power of robotic process automation is the reality if managed well. The power of cognitive automation is the promise. The power of AI is the hype. Now, you put up a statement by Kathy, who's a very good neighbor of mine, in fact, and when she says AI, she means cognitive. Because AI is using computers to try to do what minds can do, and that is actually an impossible task. I've never understood the ambition. It seems to me that you use technology to do things you can't do or don't want to do, not what you can do. And that is the liberating thing about these technologies. They free you up to do things that humans are very good at. And humans are very much cheaper to be doing those things than actual technologies. We'll come on to that later. The other thing I'd like to do is to say that we live in a world of opinion, fast-moving opinion, derived opinion, and everything I say is dependent upon the evidence that I have accumulated with my colleagues. And the research base that I refer to, and I constantly refer back to this when I'm checking out what other people say, like Kathy, is some 174 actual deployments of RPA, seen through over a number of years in some cases, 32 cognitive automation, and 5 enterprise blockchain applications, and as you can see, none AI. We scoured the globe looking for serious AI used in businesses. We found them in the high-tech companies, the obvious candidates, but nowhere were organizations even ready, let alone the technology being ready, for AI applications. It's been a hijacked term by marketing departments. Everything's suddenly AI. It used to be a respectable academic term. But even academics don't believe in the term. If you talk to professors of this area, they say smart computing would have been a better term for what we're trying to do here. So a pretty good database, probably the best one around at the moment in terms of actual rich analysis of what goes on. And there are about 45 vendors now. I discovered 3 more in China the other day when I was in Shanghai. So I'm going to have to add to that. And we've looked at about 20 plus of the major vendors in terms of deployments. I'm going to start a long way back in London because it's very useful to think through, when Russell says digital transformation, whether this sort of thing has happened before. Everyone seems to think nothing has ever happened on the planet before and everything is new. Not so. Let's have a look at a technology transformation that occurred and see if there are any analogies. There are some. And let's see if there's anything different this time. And then we're going to look in more detail at RPA and cognitive. So just to set the scene, this is London in 1900. And the first thing you'll notice about it is that the major transportation technology is the horse. 1900. There were 300,000 horses. 8 to 9% of the population were in horse-related industries, if not driving them, looking after them, picking up the manure from them. Serious jobs. And there were about 5.4 million people. London was the biggest city on earth at the time. Very nice. And of course, the horses do create problems. All technologies create problems. The stuff that we're using is massively problematic. It's just invisible sometimes. But in this case, one of the big problems was disease. The horses spread disease. If a horse had a working life of 3 years, and if it died, it was left on the street. You had to pick up the manure, and if you didn't pick up the manure, that spread disease as well, to the point where the Times actually said in 1894, if this goes on, within 50 years, London streets will be under 9 foot of manure. Well, as we know, that didn't happen. What did happen was things changed quite drastically. By 1912, the population is 7 million plus, and you can see a typical street scene there. There are horses and automobiles in a perilous juxtaposition, huge amounts of deaths and accidents occurring on the British streets. But the number of people associated with transport and horse in those times has gone down massively to about 10% of what it was in 1900. So there is, yes, a massive job loss in the horse area, including the horses. But at the same time, there is a massive gain in the area of automobile transport, etc. When you look at 1920, a familiar scene to anybody who's been to London, you can see that the horses are down to very, very few indeed. By 1926, there are none. And that's interesting. There's a complete transformation in 26 years. And I want to just ask you this question. What do you think the job loss was, and what do you think the job gain was in that 26 years? And you know subsequently what happened to automobile transport. And indeed, getting from the international airport to Auckland suggests to me that there's an awful lot of people involved in the car industry. So I don't need to push that button very hard, do I? The question then is, well, if we've seen that sort of transformation, is it going to be different this time? And my good friends at MIT, Eric Brinjolf and Andy McAfee, always argue, yes, it's going to be completely different. I beg to differ. The evidence doesn't stack up. If you start researching in research labs and talking to high-tech companies, you will get a different view of life from when you talk to businesses and people who actually deploy this. And the story is completely different. But there are similarities. So let me just go, I can go back, can I? Oh, look, I can manage the technology. Right, so we do have a clearer understanding of what it's going to look like in 2030. In 2014, we didn't know, and the big story was job loss. That's no longer the big story. There have been 5 reports this year, including our own, that suggest that the job loss story is the smaller story. The real story is the skills shift story. But let me give you some feeling for what life's going to be like in 2030, including in New Zealand. You like to see yourself as exceptional, but you're not that exceptional. So we think that 9% of the jobs in 2030 don't exist yet. We think that 60% of the jobs will be automated or supported by this kind of technology in 2030. So the story is not total jobs, but partial jobs changed. We think that 14% of the global workforce will change occupations. We think that 18% of jobs will be lost, but 17% will be gained as a result, direct result of this technology. And so the story will not be a job loss story. And if you want to look at other reports than me, look at Asia Development Bank, look at PricewaterhouseCoopers, look at McKinsey's, and look at World Economic Forum. They all come out with the same story this year. They don't come out with the story there will be 47% job loss in the USA, as written by my colleagues in Oxford University in 2014. An excellent study, but it's got so many flaws in terms of what it omits that you don't really want to read that or believe it. But of course the journalists love that because it makes a great headline. And the headlines will go on pushing this job loss story, hiding the skill shift story that is really where we should be and what we need to take action on. And that's a big one because globally, if you look at the 20 biggest economies in the world, they are short of 90 million people when it comes to medium and high skills and the sorts of skills we need to run this digital transformation technology. But they have a surplus of 95 million low skills. That tells you the story in 2 figures. 95 million surplus low skills, 90 million shortage medium high skills already in the world. Why do people automate? because of the dramatic increase in the amount of work to be done and because of skill shortages. If you want to know why China is automating like mad, it's because they are short of skills. They are short of the equivalent of 600 million workers between now and 2024 in order to deliver on their declared economic growth aspirations. They're not alone in that. USA is short of 15 million people between 2015 and 2020. I don't know the figures for New Zealand, but I do know that in terms of your readiness for this, the technologies, you are in the tier 2. The top nations are the USA and China in terms of readiness. New Zealand plus Australia, I use it wisely in that way, right? Are in tier 2 in terms of readiness, enablers in place. You have underinvested in all this, on automation, but the opportunity is massive for you to gain a productivity hit of potentially an average between now and 2030, 1.2% on your GDP. That is the potential of these technologies in combination. And it will accelerate in the second 5 years of that period, the last 5 years of that period. So the other slightly bad news for you is that if you're in Tier 2, there are 17 countries in Tier 2, Scandinavia and the obvious candidates, you're at the bottom of that Tier 2. So you've got room to, you're within threshold, but you need to work a lot more at the enablers. So that's where we are on the macro story. Have I finished yet, Russell? Is that time up? Oh, no, we've got more. Okay. So we're now going to move into the service automation landscape. And just to clarify, you have to disaggregate this. The first thing to say about the market is that actually, when you read all the statements about massive impact, the tsunami of automation, job losses, and all that, you've got to start looking at the figures of how big the market is on automation. And it's incredibly small. Immediately, there's a paradox here. But it's an exponential growth. But even the exponential growth shows you that at the wildest analysis, there are only going to be a market of $46.5 billion for RPA, CA, and AI by 2024. That's not huge. My good colleagues in the audience are experts in outsourcing here, Ilan and Julia, just migrated wisely to New Zealand. And they will tell you that the market for outsourcing of IT and BPO is about $1.7 trillion. Now, that automation is a very, very small market and will be for a long while. So the tsunami of job loss is not going to happen. But you have to disaggregate where the money is going to be spent. At the moment, it's being spent on robotic process automation, and it will be increasingly spent, what Kathy was talking about, on cognitive automation. And indeed, it is 2 years behind where RPA is now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all this stuff in the back end of the presentation, but I want to focus a little bit on robotic process automation, because that's really interesting. Those of you who are not into this area yet will think that all these tools are the same, or all the vendors are selling something called RPA. Not so, that's just a badge, but in fact it hides at least 4 kinds of RPA, and lots of stuff in between. So you've got desktop recorded automation, which is where basically you do something manually, you can get it recorded, and so if you play the automation version, it will do it much quicker. And if you've optimized the way that you do the process, then that's pretty good. Very often you haven't, they just record it and replay it, and so there's lower productivity. There's enterprise server RPA. I'm trying very hard not to mention any vendors whatsoever today, but I will if you ask me questions about it. The interesting thing about the vendors of desktop recorded automation is they usually design the tool from the desktop to operate in the desktop to declare independence from the IT function, to give business an opportunity to do a quick win and get business value and productivity without knowing too much about IT. The enterprise server people tend to design it from the enterprise to be safe and reliable and consistent and to work with enterprise systems, SAP, Oracle, etc., ERP. And so they tend to have different characteristics and attributes and abilities. Then there is the professional IT software development tools, self-development kits, which gives you a nice, easy user application interface, but a little bit of software, and then you have to code like mad in order to make it usable with the particular processors. And then there's increasingly cloud RPA. I was in the Australian government, I'm allowed to mention the word Australia, aren't I? Yeah. Australian government yesterday, Canberra, and they said, well, we don't do that sort of thing, you know, it's a security and all the rest of it. But increasingly, there's a nice company in Finland called Digital Workforce who do this. You can beam down your automated tool and use it as on a rental basis. And that's going to be, when you commodify this stuff more in the future, that's going to be quite a big hit in the future. So you've got at least 4 kinds, just to stereotype this, kinds of RPA, and there are types of RPA in between these. Some of the desktop RPA vendors are trying to get to enterprise RPA. Some of the professional IT software development tools vendors are trying to get to enterprise RPA. The reason being that if you want to really scale, you want to go down the enterprise RPA route, essentially. So, and that's looking further into the future, what you want to do once you've done RPA and got the benefit from it. And then there's all this stuff on cognitive automation, which I'll give you examples of later on. But you can see that the story of our cognitive automation is it's a massive promise. We've seen some very interesting use cases. There are some really distinctive challenges with cognitive, which I haven't got time to go into today, which are different from RPA. But it sits on top of RPA, complements it, and sort of RPA on steroids. It can do things that RPA can't do, and a lot more besides. Just as one example, Russell mentioned that RPA can only use structured data. He put up that nice slide. That's true, but cognitive can structure data for you. I'll give you an example of that later on. There are many other things that these different cognitive tools can do, and it's likely that the cognitive automation market, as Kathy says, is going to be 10 times the size of the RPA market in the future, but it's not just yet. It's around the corner. So we're going to focus a little bit on robotic process automation, and Russell's going to keep his eye closely on the time. That's a book we wrote in about risk. Yeah. Right, so the phrase I coined about RPA, and Russell said they know about RPA, don't talk too much about RPA, what it is and all the rest of it. So I said, okay, so at least I can throw at you how I got to this term, which is it takes the robot out of the human. And essentially it does the repetitive tasks that human beings have increasingly been doing for 135 years, following scientific management principles, that you don't like doing and you're not very good at doing. Let's face it, we don't want to be robots. So if you can take the robot out of the human, that's a positive thing, and that's what RPA does. I see it as a liberationist technology more than anything myself, and then certainly that's how it's being used in all the examples that we've seen. The interesting thing about cognitive and AI, just to play on the words here, is that what you're trying to do there is to try to put the human into the robot. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an incredibly difficult task. We have lots of research labs all over the world trying to work on that one, and I think it's misdirected myself. But enough of my opinions on that one. This is what it does, and the promise has materialized in a number of more mature organizations. The promise, the reality is that you can get a triple win with robotic process automation. I was staggered by this. I didn't even know what RPA meant in November 2014. It was explained to me by the inventor of the term, Patrick Geary of Blue Prism. And he explained it to me, and I thought, wow, this is just a productivity tool. You know, and where's the meat? Give me some clients who've actually experienced this. And I didn't anticipate what I found and what we found, Mary Lasty and myself. We thought that it would be essentially about operational efficiencies and some ROI, but basically a back office tool. It didn't turn out that way, and I don't think a lot of people using it anticipated what it could do, because it's a pretty dumb piece of software, let's face it. in some cases with some vendors, surrounded by very smart software that gets it into enterprise-friendly mode. But if you look at the triple win that we found, and we've got organizations that have all these things, everything on there, the organization actually gains as a benefit. Yes, high first-year ROIs. We've seen between 30 and 200% ROI in the first year. Telefonica O2 was getting 650% ROI after 3 years, 800% on one process. The interesting metric that you will get into if you get into this is hours back to the business. So Shop Direct, Lindsay Harrison at Shop Direct now gets 350,000 hours back to the business as a result of automation, and is extending the automation to other processes at request by the senior management. I think they're running into a bit of problems at Shop Direct, so it's a tool to get them out of problems. You've got of the obvious operational efficiencies. The one that I didn't anticipate was regulatory compliance. So I went to Gazprom Energy, and they used it to meet a regulatory requirement very quickly. There are huge fines in the UK if you don't meet a regulatory requirement in the finance or utilities. Aviva Insurance was fined £8.4 million for not meeting a regulatory requirement. So this is a good use. And they said that previously, to meet the requirement, they would have had taken 3 months and hired 30 temps. It took them 6 weeks when they automated, and they used the same software. It didn't cost them anything to use the same software because this software can be multi-use. And that gives you some sense of why people buy into this tool. The other unanticipated advantage was the improvements in the customer experience. Again, you thought, well, it's located in the back office, so why would it have an effect on the customer? But I'll give you one example. Telefonica O2 sells mobiles and things like that. You want to replace a SIM card, it used to take 2 days. It now takes 20 minutes. If you've got a complaint at Virgin Trains, and there are plenty of those, thousands a day in Britain, I'm sure you have the same thing here. The complaints used to be handled manually, and they never could staff that because it's such a boring job. They automated most of that, and I think they reduced the number of people involved in that from 35 to 5, freeing up people to deal with the serious idiosyncratic complaints. And a big advantage in terms of money saved there. So what it can do is remove the pain points and enhance the customer journey. And the other unanticipated thing was employees liked it. And the reason that they liked it was one of the undisclosed things that is happening in all these developed economies is no one talks about it, but I'm going to write a paper on it quite soon. There is a dramatic increase in the amount of work to be done. And when you go into organizations, you ask, why are you automating? They don't say, we want to lose headcount, unless you're in America and parts of America. I mean, they do say, we want to lose headcount. They're very traditionalist there sometimes, despite who their president is, saying that it's not about job loss, etc. Actually, the president says, don't mention AI. It frightens people. But if you generally go into an organization to research it, they say, why do you want this automation? They say, dramatically increasing the amount of work to be done, can't employ enough people. That's what they actually say, the top two things. And actually employees gain from it. They get to more interesting work. They restructure their work. They learn new skills. It looks like a progress into new technologies. They get enhanced reputation as an innovator within their organizations. And we have plenty of examples of all that. So, nice story so far. Sounds too good to be true. But I trust him because he's a professor. I've only got 3 minutes. Right. So we wrote a risk guide in 2017 because we discovered that we had sort of inadvertently oversold RPA. We only looked at success stories. There weren't that many stories around at the time, to be honest. It really took off in the early 2017. And when it took off, a lot of people didn't know what they were doing and clearly hadn't read our first book. Fortunately, a number of people in this room have, and they're testament to the fact that it works, I think. Anyway, it drove us, our experience in 2017, to write a new book about risk mitigation, the definitive guide. And we studied our successes and failures across the vendors, and we came up with very interesting findings. We found a lot more projects running into risks and challenges. We found that not all vendor tools and platforms were the same, and we managed to identify 30 action principles to mitigate the risks. So there are a lot of reports out in 2017. You can see a few of them there: ISG, HFS, Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young one's quite interesting because they're dealing with actual clients. 30 to 50% project stalling, abandoned, moving to other solutions, blah, blah, blah. Now, this is not a commentary on RPA. It's a commentary on how people manage RPA. The story of technology, which I learned from 1979 onwards, I worked in 9 years in project management, and then by the time we got to 1989, we realized that it was not really about the technology. Only 25% of it was about the technology. It is difficult, yeah, etc. But 75% of it was about indifferent management. And it's true with RPA. And most of the things that were there, I'm not bore you with the detailed LSE analysis of emerging issues. I'll just point to a few things. What they found was that they were underfunded, not taken seriously at senior management level. They didn't scale. They bought the wrong tool because it didn't scale to enterprise level. And that's what they wanted to do. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. They didn't put governance in on day one. They didn't get all the stakeholders on board, including the IT function. All these types of things. We could sort of go on and on, but those would be the top problems. So we actually identified 41 material risks coming out of all those deployments. And again, I won't go around this in any great detail, but you can see that risk occurs at every point in the life cycle of deployment, from strategy, thinking small, too short term, through using the wrong sourcing model. We'll look at what people actually do who are effective in a minute. Choosing the wrong tool for what you want to achieve, not getting the stakeholder buy-in. That became a very big one by September 2017. There was lots of that. Then running into launch projects. I was in Canberra yesterday and we had the military in the front row, and those forbidding, frightening uniforms were barking at me. And I said, well, you will all know that, your plan is redundant with the first engagement with the enemy. You'll understand what I'm saying when launching the project is real difficulty. And they all laughed, and I felt a bit more comfortable. The operational executions, you discover that robots don't behave like people. They don't behave, actually. And all these metaphors that make the comparisons between humans and machines are massively misleading. But we do it automatically because we talk metaphorically, and we like to think of them as human beings. I won't get too far into the aside on how in every organization we went to, they were creating visuals of the robots they were relating to, and anthropomorphizing them and calling them names. And in the USA, when I went there, I said, well, surely they're sane here. They won't do what they were doing in the UK. And sure enough, they were anthropomorphizing them. We had Robo Downey Jr., Robo De Niro, and they all had names that you could, and they were treated as people you could relate to, tireless workers. Change management became a real issue. Maturity. Let me move on. So what we identified, and I can't go into this in any great detail, but I'll give you some selected points in a minute, is that you can take action around the life cycle on all these points in order to mitigate the risks, and there are risks. I'll just talk a little bit about strategy initially. Most of organizations we've seen under optimize on RPA. They don't go in big enough. They don't spend enough time. They don't look 3 to 5 years ahead and say, where is this going to be with us? What is it going to do for us in 3 to 5 years' time? The answer is it's going to be a foundation for cognitive automation, and then digital technologies. But if you haven't got that vision, you have a very short-term view. Most organizations sort of have been going into it in this way. They start at phase one, and someone senior says, this RPA sounds interesting, give us the ROI, a more traditional view of what technology does. And you treat it as another piece of software. We stick it in, and hopefully something will happen. You then learn the hard way that actually it can do various things, but good and bad practices emerge. What I suggest to you is that we now know enough about RPA and indeed cognitive to accelerate your learning into phase 3 and become strategic from day one. Think about 3 to 5 years ahead what the endpoint is, building a center of excellence that will be a service automation center of excellence, not an RPA center of excellence, and be ambitious as to what you want from it rather than focus on cost savings or headcount or opportunistic quick wins. There are very few organizations in phase 4, ladies and gentlemen. About 15% of deployments are in phase 4 at the moment, and they started some time ago, and they have hundreds of robots, some of those. But even something like Shop Direct that I mentioned earlier has only got 90 robots, but is doing massive amount of productivity gains in the back office and improving customer experience. Sourcing and tool selection. I don't know whether all of you have already sourced and tooled yourselves up. The findings from our survey is that the most common choice is to do it yourself, build up your retained capability. By the way, there's a growing skill shortage in this area, so it's best to grow your own, because it's going to be very expensive to actually go to the market here and quite difficult to fulfill the jobs. But most people build a retained capability but use advisors and partners and experienced people a lot in order to build up the learning in-house. Tool platform selection is a more difficult thing. It's important to know what you want to achieve over 3 to 5 years before you choose them. You can choose stereotypically. You have 3 choices really, and vendors fit between these sometimes. Any of these can be a good choice, but not in a vacuum, in a specific context. And most of the people who go in for regulatory compliance and want very high scale and security go for enterprise RPA. But we've started doing something I call the economics of automation. No one else is studying that at the moment. And it's very difficult to get the data, and I'm getting the data together. And this is my first go at what the different journeys are. And the different journey, I mean, you can take this away. We're going to distribute the slides, aren't we, Russell? Are we? Have you got the capability to do it? Oh, it's just my permission. Yeah, sure. I mean, there will be a version of it, but this will be in the pack. So you can read this at your leisure, but our first go at it is that Journey 1 is cheap and easy at the front end, desktop recorded automation, but when you start scaling and trying to do different things with it, it starts to have massive hidden costs and delays. So you need to take that on the board. Enterprise robotic process automation tends to be a bit more difficult at the front end. The license fee looks a bit more expensive, but over time, actually, there are very few hidden costs. And actually, it works out that it becomes much more effective and efficient. And if you like coding, then SDK is the way to go. IT development and all the rest of it. And a lot of organizations have tried that, usually through the IT function, because they're familiar with that kind of IT development. But again, you will find, I think, this is only 70% correct, we're trying to get the figures from clients on this, that it will have multiple challenges, high cost and time resource, struggle over future positioning. I'll put this one up. I choose this one because it's the big thing that happened in 2017. That a lot of people thought this was just another piece of software, and in fact, it's about change management. It's about transformation, and you need to treat it as a change management program. And so, stakeholder buy-in becomes absolutely critical. And you can genuinely sell RPA as the left-hand side, but make sure it's true. What people hate most of all in times of change is uncertainty. So you have to be very clear quite consistent in the messages, keep repeating them, and the messages that you can genuinely say about RPA is that it offers less repetitive, boring work, it enables you to learn new skills and new roles, they will be your co-workers, you can focus on customer services and the things that humans are much better at, and you will get recognition for innovation. And when it comes to job threat, actually most organizations go down in that priority. Wait for natural attrition, redeploy staff, remove the work from the outsourcers first, but very often you're giving them more work from somewhere else in the organization. So very often the impact on outsourcers in India and Philippines is much less than people think it's going to be. That's what the stats show us over the next 5 years. You change the onshore-offshore mix, you move more work onshore, or finally redundancy and early retirement. And the surveys show that that's exactly what happens. The dominant approach is redeployment within the organization or another work unit. The next approach is reduce FTEs from the provider, and then there's a series of additional things that can be done. Natural attrition, layoffs, slow recruitment, early recruitment is the other approach. So there's not really a job loss story there at the top of the line, as you can see. Launch projects. I get this one from one of the pioneers, Wayne Butterfield. He lent me this slide, and he said at Telefonica O2 in our first book, he said basically if you can save the equivalent of 3 full-time workers by automating something, it's well worth doing. But there are so many other potential benefits that you still have to make the case to the finance department, but if you can do that, then that's fine. The other thing is it only applies to certain processes. It can apply to processes in any kind of organization, but it has to be rules-based. You can write rules, instructions, you can configure the software, a standardized process, high volumes, mature, optimized, stable is the ideal process to go for. The other thing you need to do is to, day one, build a mature capability. I rather like this statement by Pat. You have to plan for where this is going to be, not where it is now. You have to build a foundation for a tower block, not a bungalow. When I was in Shanghai recently, they have all these skyscrapers. The highest I reached was 89, floor 89. And they have a series of escalators to get there, elevators. And some RPA will only get you to the fourth floor, then you have to change elevators, and sometimes you have to change again. If you want to get to 89, where the restaurant is and the booze, you have to build the foundations underneath the tower block to create the 89-story thing. Most people who buy desktop recorded automation are building a bungalow with no real foundations to get them to level 89. That's the analogy I used in Shanghai, and they all recognized that we wouldn't have these skyscrapers if we didn't have serious foundations. And that involves really building something, a center of excellence that would have these components. You'd staff this with specialist people. There'd be a funnel of demand. They would approve or disapprove the project. Then there'd be a group of people developing the process and configuring the software. You'd have a group of people who would throw that into the reuse component library for use elsewhere, and a group of people controlling that. Interestingly, at one company, I think it was N-Power Utility, they had 300 robots and they had 2 controllers. And they didn't make any mistakes at all, those 2 controllers. And then you need quality assurance and continuous improvement cycles. The next phase that we're in now, which is why we called our third book The Next Phase, is moving into the use of cognitive automation. And here's an example of it where it's actually been done. Not surprisingly, it's a global services company. It's actually IBM using IBM Watson. They do eat their own dog food at IBM sometimes, and they like Watson. They used it in their massive operation help desk for global services, external clients and internal ones. So the demand comes in all different forms. If it's a standardized template, structured data, it goes into the RPA tool. which takes it and then decides what to do. If it's unstructured demand, they use a cognitive automation tool, IBM Watson. It goes to the RPA tool, which then says, oh, we need to do the following, send it to the cognitive automation tool. And they have an algorithm within the cognitive automation tool that basically says, right, who are the top 10 people in the world within IBM who can solve this problem now? And it prioritizes that and sends that to the RPA tool, which then executes that decision, tries each one of those people until they hit one, and then that executes that decision and manages fulfillment to make sure that the problem is resolved, and it relates that to both the client and the person resolving the problem. Here's another one. Have I got time for this one, Russell? Where's Russell gone? Gone for a coffee? 5 minutes, yes. I love this one, and I'm not going to have time to talk it in any detail, but if you go and knock someone down in the street and Zurich Insurance is your company, all right, they will make a complaint against you and they have to provide a medical report saying why this is a valid claim. And so Zurich Insurance people have to establish that it's a valid claim. They have to read a medical report, which takes 56 minutes, and look at the photographs of the injury and costs how much it's worth giving for that injury, broken arm or something. Right, so they got a cognitive automation tool that does that now. Very powerful stuff. Expert System Germany designed it. And it now takes 5 seconds to manage that medical report and suggest whether it's a valid claim or not, which is then adjudicated by human beings. And a high reduction in the leakage through standardized decision making, 24/7 availability, saved $5 million a year in first year, and freed up 39,000 hours of capacity in human work terms. 5 minutes, right. Eventually you're going to end up with an ecosystem very quickly. This is Orange France, who sell routers. They get a lot of people complaining the router doesn't work. Actually, 50% of the ones returned do work. It's just that we're, you know, you can't legislate for idiots like me, you know, and I'm one of the worst. But in order to manage that, they've automated it, and they've got a suite of automations. AwareX gets stuff from omni-channels. Reinfer gets that data and structures it, labels it, gives insight into the patterns there, and gives it to Blue Prism in this case, that executes billing and fulfillment. ProAdapt is a systems integrator. Incognito is a quality assurance on service at the end. And it all, and they saved, I might have got this figure wrong, but it's of the order of 45 million euros in the first year of operating this particular ecosystem. There are some major challenges. There we go. Your biggest challenge is data. Most of you have got crap data, let me be honest, frank. I don't know you, but sorry if it sounds insulting. But you would not be alone in that. You know, we've done technology not very well. We've done data incredibly badly, let's face it. And you will come up against that the minute you try to use a cognitive automation tool. And I won't go into detail of the sort of crap data you got, but essentially about 16% of your data is mission critical that you have in your place, and most of it needs to go through any form of washing machine you have or rejection in order to make it work. And there are limitations of machine learning, which are becoming more apparent as we use it more and more, and trying to replicate it as the brain using it is a mistake, I think. But the real problem is the cognitive automation, what happens when it hits all, systems, organizations. You come across all these massive silos, data silos, technology silos, structure silos, process silos, mindset silos that are really inhibitors of this sort of stuff. So becoming mature involves your next stage is getting to the right RPA that gives you a focus into the future, unless you want an opportunistic quick win, or you're so small that you don't need to think too much about cognitive automation, and link that with what's happening in all these emerging technologies, we reckon there are 9 emerging technologies that are going to have massive impact. I can do a whole day on each one of those. In fact, there's a 10th, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say. My co-author, Mary Lasty, has added a 10th. It still fixed the smack braid thing, and the 10th is augmented reality. And I'll have to research that next. It never ends, does it? So your problem is moving from RPA to CA to that. Final slide, I think, Russell, you'll be relieved to hear. What we did not find, I mean, we call it research because we don't really know what we're going to find. Unless we're forced the evidence to fit what we think in advance. But RPA is only used to replace humans with technology. We didn't find that. We found actually it was used to do a lot more work with about the same number of people. We found people embrace the technology. We found that the IT department was a absolutely critical thing to have underneath you, with you on your journey. It's not bringing jobs back from offshore. I'm going to allow one comment about Donald Trump. We call this the Donald Trump fallacy. It won't bring back more jobs if you do less outsourcing. They will be automated, so that's not going to happen. It's driven by multiple business benefits. It doesn't replace an entire person's job. We're nearly there. You can smile now. You can apply RPA to any process. Not true. You'll run into that one, and people like Quanton will help you with that one. A whole process needs to be automated. Not true. We've seen great ROIs from sub-processors. Not all RPA supplier tools scale easily and are enterprise friendly. And it's not true that RPA is being replaced by cognitive and AI tools. It's the foundation for them rather than being replaced by them. Many thanks for your attention this morning.